Welcome back, adventurers! In our last episode, we witnessed the birth of a love story forged in the crucible of the American West. Our protagonists navigated a world of danger and deception, their bond deepening with each challenge they faced. Now, as the story shifts to the Gilded Age of New York City, the past casts a long shadow. Secrets, long buried, are about to be unearthed, and the consequences could be earth-shattering. Will our heroes find closure and redemption, or will the ghosts of the past consume them? Prepare to be captivated as we delve into the final chapter of this epic tale. It's a Business. Chapter 3. So it was easy for me to say with absolute certainty, "You will never regret loving me. I swear that on my grave." The new town of Denver was at the confluence of Cherry Creek and the South Platte River. When we arrived, it was mostly tents. Originally, there was gold in the creek, but the really rich deposits were in the mountains to the west. Still, all the supplies and mining equipment had to come from somewhere. And Denver was the terminus of the Pikes Peak Express. It was the only connection to the east. Thus, it was trade, not mining, that made Denver a boomtown. Of course, no boomtown can consider itself civilized if it doesn't have an upscale place to relax. May was called upon to provide this important service. She, in turn, sent her protege to build relationships. That's why Amy and I ended up there. After our adventure with Abigail and the Indians, we were in no hurry to get back to Denver. The reason it took so long was that we couldn't tear ourselves away from each other, learning more and more information. Besides, we needed to work out the details of our developing relationship. Oddly enough, it was Amy who was inexperienced. I was married. I knew how to be with someone. Amy had never had anything but a brief affair, so she had to get used to living in a close and loving relationship. It wasn't easy at first. For example, Amy was not used to waking up to being hugged. The first time it happened, she jumped to her feet in fright. She was also nervous when I did nice things for her. It was as if she suspected ulterior motives, and she apologized too often. Her behavior was easy to understand. I knew I was completely devoted to her, but she didn't know that. All her life she had been mistreated. Now she had put her soul on the line, hoping I was different, and she could lose everything if I turned out to be like every other man. We talked whenever one of the ghosts from her past showed up on her doorstep. Eventually, each of those ghosts found peace. It was very moving to watch Amy slowly begin to trust me, and these conversations convinced me that she would rather die than betray me, which of course was a bit frivolous given her former profession. And yet, I was more confident in Amy's loyalty than I'd ever been with a normal woman. Amy had experienced the worst that life had to offer. Therefore, she understood the value of her current position and made no assumptions about its permanence. This fact, more than anything else, reinforced my faith in our long-term prospects. When we returned, we found that Pat and Aphrodite were busy. May had bought a plot in the center of town, and our two friends had already pitched a big tent. They were doing a land office. Behind, the frame of a permanent structure was already being erected, and construction was in full swing, for there were many miners who needed a crib. I went down to the Pikes Peak office, while Amy and Pat watched the construction. I had a plan that I wanted to put into action. It was the first fruit of the agreement Amy and I had reached. She was still the manager of the best vacation spot in Denver, but we really wanted to get married, so I had to find a way to support us. My trump card was a stake left over from the last whaling voyage. That was only 3 years ago. At any rate, it was enough to enable me to deceive thousands of fools in their haste to make their fortunes in the gold mines. In fact, in many respects, gold mining was as immoral as my future wife's former profession, and yet much more lucrative. I made an arrangement with a manager at an express service. For a small percentage of the profits, he would deliver the goods. Then I would sell them for 20 times the price. Our arrangement would make us both rich. Amy, for her part, hated being part of May's stable. But she had studied the craft up and down and was a shrewd businesswoman, so she promised to keep an eye on the developing stable until Aphrodite felt confident enough to replace her. She told me it's a male fantasy that women get pleasure from the business they sell. She called it dirty and degrading, but on the other hand, it was necessary to survive. I remembered that she had told me the same thing the first day we met. We lived in a small tent next to the big one. During the day, I did my supply business. And every night, I spent in the main tent with Pat, manning the bar and scaring off rowdy miners. At first, Amy didn't like my presence. Eventually, I took her aside and asked, "Do you love me?" Her strange violet eyes flashed brightly. She replied, "How can you ask me such a question when you have my very soul in the palm of your hand?" I said, "Then why are you acting so aloof? You are supposed to be the owner of this place, not a representative of the local Christian women's organization." She looked at me perplexed and said, "Iya?" I laughed and said, "As if you were here to eradicate all the sins of this profession." She said in horror, "Really? Oh my God." I took her dainty chin between two fingers, tilted her head so that she was looking directly into my eyes, and said lovingly, "I have no doubt that your heart belongs only to me. I also know that you will never betray that love, so get back out there and be as stunningly beautiful as ever." Then I added with a stone face, "Just don't disappear into the back room." Amy looked shocked. Then she saw my face blur into laughter. She made an indignant sound, slapped my arm, and went back to the evening trade. I was there every night, so I would know if Amy had ever tried her hand at her former vocation. She, for her part, was almost pathologically wary of even approaching the back of the tent. It was hilarious to watch her wiggle her way through her hosting duties. And of course, she killed me with her kindness every night. Amy and I were married on July 21st, 1861. It wasn't just the date of our wedding. It was the date of the first Battle of Bull Run. No doubt it was inevitable that people in the East would start a war over slavery. Still, it was surprising when the two parts of the country went from fervent rhetoric to actually shooting at each other. It didn't affect the people in the West one bit. The shipments continued because money had to be made. The miners still brought their gold, and guys who didn't want to fight on either side showed interest in visiting us. Henry James, Mark Twain, William Dean Howells, and even adventurers like Bill Cody have passed through our doors. By then, we had built a swanky vacation spot, and Aphrodite had taken over the role of Mrs. Amy. Amy, in turn, put her steady hand and shrewd business sense into supply management, and thanks to her, we were making more than enough money. One bright and shining summer morning, I walked into a store and saw my wife chatting with an Indian girl. It was such a strange sight that I almost spilled my coffee. Then, the Indian girl turned to face me, and I dropped my cup. It was Abigail, and she was thriving. Abigail was still smiling in greeting. Her porcelain blue Southern Belle eyes were calm and peaceful, and she looked happy. The old Abigail was nervous, droopy, and a little puffy. The woman standing in front of me was a woman with rawhide skin, clearly tough and commanding. Amy knew that Abigail's appearance would surprise me, so she quickly added, "Abigail has news for us, honey. You're going to want to hear it." Abigail replied cordially, "It's good to see you, Jacob. You've always been good to me, even though I've been out of my mind most of the time. Now I want to do you a favor." She opened her palm and revealed a strange gray stone that clearly had a gold stitch in it. She said, "Some of the men found it. We have no use for this devilish material, but we know you attach great importance to it." Abigail continued, "I'll show you where we found it. I think it's something you and my sister might need." It made sense. Abigail and Amy were half-sisters, and Abigail had willingly followed Amy when she'd been sold to May. But even after that, we'd followed Abigail when she'd been kidnapped and honored her wish to stay with her captors. So there was a deep connection between us. Maybe Abigail was leading us to something more than just a nugget of gold. So I saddled the mule, kissed Amy goodbye, and followed Abigail, or Heron Woman, as she preferred to call herself now, out of town. The same two Indians were waiting for us higher up the trail. We headed west in the general direction of Clear Creek Canyon. There was active gold mining there, but my guides turned and headed a little north, toward the initial heights of the Front Range. We drove for several hours until we reached a pine-covered cleft in a steep cliff. The day was getting hot, so it was very pleasant when a man got off his horse and walked into the cool shade of the cleft between the rocks. It was about 30 yards wide. He walked some distance and then pointed to the rock, and sure enough, there was a distinct golden seam. I hammered off a small piece with a pickaxe, nodded to him, and we walked back to where Abigail and the other husband. Abigail said thoughtfully, as if she'd been waiting for those words for a long time. This will repay my debt to you too. You won't see me again. Rest assured, I am happy at last. The three of them turned their ponies and trotted away. I watched them go. Abigail was hurting in her own way, just like Amy. I was glad she was finally at peace. I got back to Denver in the evening and headed straight to the appraiser's office. I wanted to find out how lucky we were. The nuggets in my saddlebags looked pretty rich, so this was clearly a bid I could stake out. The assay office in Denver wasn't just a lone guy in a little shack like most gold towns. It had the staff and equipment to grade the ore that was brought in from the Front Range in a timely manner. I wanted the analysis done quickly, so I turned it over to the head assayer, who was an acquaintance of mine. Then I returned to the luxurious new house we had built with the proceeds from our supply business. Amy was fiddling in the kitchen. She asked with vague interest, "Was there something in there?" Abigail was always too melodramatic. I said, "There was something, but I don't know what." Then I added, "On the other hand, Abigail seems to have found her place in life?" Amy smiled and replied, "Yes, she has 2 manly husbands and a child." I added, to change the subject, "Well, I took what they showed me to the assay office. We'll find out tomorrow if it's worth claiming the place." It was a warm and sunny Wednesday morning when I walked into the office of the head assayer. Seth was an elderly man. Rumor had it that he was a professor back east. True, until he was caught spending an awful lot of time with one of his female students. Now he was doing stone assaying in the middle of nowhere. Such is the wages of sin. Anyway, he was an affable guy, liked to talk, like most of these over-educated guys. He said, "You have a rich vein, Jacob, but it is difficult to determine the exact amount of gold, for the rock in which it is embedded is pure silver." Did he just say silver? The entire surface of the rock was made of that material. Seth kept talking, ignoring my astonished reaction. He said, "That happens a lot in this area. God must have been very angry when he created our mountains, because everything here is fused together." I said, disbelieving, "Are you saying there is only silver and gold in these 2 samples?" Seth said, "Yes, it looks like you've hit the mother lode. If I were you, I would go to the state claims office as soon as possible." So that's the whole story of how Amy and I became unspeakably and somewhat undeservedly rich. We registered the site the same day and laid the land in the evening. Then I gave Pat 1/3 of the profits, if he would help me move the ore out. By then, he and Aphrodite had 2 children and needed the money. We hastily made arrangements with the men to look after a resting place and a store of supplies. Then we rode out of town on our trusty Conestoga and headed for the camp at Clear Creek. We had to disappear quickly. Seth was bound to blab, and people have been killed for more than that. The extraction was relatively simple. The vein ran right along the sides of the rift in the rock, so we didn't have to do much digging. I was in my early 20s, and I was as strong as I had ever been. Pat was a hard worker, and Aphrodite was stronger than him. Amy's main job was to scare away visitors. She did this with the help of her Henry. It was very difficult, but in the end we got a little over $20 million out of that suit. And in that respect, a couple of girls, a traveling Irishman, and a traveling sailor did quite well. After that, our lives could have gone down different roads. But Amy and I had our direction determined by what happened one beautiful evening the following April. We had lunch at Pell's Oyster House. I can hear you saying, "Oysters? Denver is 1,000 miles from the sea. How could you eat oysters?" Well, the new transcontinental railroad allowed suppliers to ship these tasty critters live in portable tank cars. And so oysters became a hot commodity in Denver. That's if you could afford them, and we could. Amy causes a stir every time she appears in public. She's just extraordinarily beautiful, but today she was especially stunning. She entered the restaurant in a silk dress that was one shade lighter than the deep purple color of her eyes. And while it was quite appropriate, it showed off every inch of her stunning figure. It was crowded. But one guy caught my eye right away. He was sitting with a group of 4 people at a table against the wall. Denver had become a pretty big trading center after the Colorado Central Railroad joined us with the Transcontinental Railroad in Cheyenne, and these guys obviously came to town to set up a little business. The stranger stared at Amy. Then he said something to the group, and everyone turned to look at her. All the other guys in the place were sneaking glances at my wife. So it wasn't strange that she was enjoying the undivided attention of a table full of men. It was just that this group was so frank. Then the man who had originally spotted Amy stepped back and walked toward us. He was clearly a salesman, dressed a little too flashily, in a plaid suit and derby hat. He had a wide, knowing grin on his fat face. We were seated in a small alcove in the back. I always make sure the maitre d' puts us in the best seat. In the light of the gas lamps, Amy was a model of serene beauty. She had her back to the approaching man, so I patted her arm and nodded behind her. She turned and looked at him curiously. He seemed absolutely thrilled to meet her. He said cheerfully, "Hello, little lady. I was wondering where you disappeared to after you left New Orleans. Tonight, I want to buy something of your special favor. That is, after you're done with this guy." We were both miles away from May, both in miles and in personal history, but Amy is truly an unforgettable woman. And this guy was clearly a former client. Amy threw me a panicked look. I nodded back. "Let me handle it." At that, the hurricane shutters slammed shut on my wife's eyes, and she took on that impenetrable expression I knew and hated so well. It killed me how quickly she could disappear behind the forbidding walls of her psyche. I stood up and said in a tone that made it clear I wanted this guy to leave, "You must be mistaken, my good man. This is my wife." He didn't understand at all what I had just said, because he was looking at Amy avidly. He said, "I've had a lot of girls, but you're the best. Where do you work, honey?" Luckily, he was facing the alcove, so it was just me and Amy. I didn't want to make a fuss, so I grabbed his arm, untwisted him, and led him out the door. He protested every step of the way, but his complaints went unheeded. This guy didn't even realize the danger he was in. He saw a rich man, well-groomed and fashionably dressed. But we all have a past. It takes terrible strength and absolute ruthlessness to throw a 30-pound whale iron with enough force to kill a whale. Moreover, this primal ferocity lurks beneath my surface like a river of molten lava. The man's careless words brought everything to the surface. I dragged him into the alley, lifted him up, and slammed him against the wall. The thunderous impact knocked the spirit out of him. I still had him pinned against the wall when he finally managed to catch his breath. I said through clenched teeth, "You're going to lose your spirit right here in this alley if you don't go inside immediately and apologize for your mistake." In the flickering light of the gas lamps, he saw the image of death, and he shook with horror. He nodded weakly. He had already wet himself. I very carefully lowered him to the ground and wiped his back on his coat, which was soaked with paint. Then I gestured silently for him to return to our table. He walked up to Amy, who was looking at him with the hooded look in her eyes that I had seen so often during our trip west, and meekly said, "I apologize for my perplexity, madam. I see now that you are quite a different woman." Amy smiled kindly and said with hidden meaningfulness, "I understand. People often misunderstand me." Then he turned and strode away. I looked at my wife eloquently and said, "Why don't we go home, dear? I don't think we have anything more to do here." She rose gracefully, held out her hand and said, "Yes, I have had more than enough." On the way home, she asked me, "What did you do to him there?" We felt the whole building swaying. I gently replied, "I simply explained to him the disastrous consequences of poor vision, and he accepted the remark." Amy gave me one of her feline smiles and spent the rest of the evening thanking her knight in shining armor. This incident made the choice for us. We had to get as far away from Amy's past as possible. So we decided to reinvent ourselves in America's most populous city. So, unlike most people of our time, we traveled to the fabled island of Manhattan. We bought a mansion in Millionaire's Row, right next door to Pierpont Morgan's luxurious mansion. I struck up a friendship with JP while I was investing our gold and silver reserves. He was young then, not the old walrus you see in the pictures, and was just starting out. Therefore, he needed capital. Accordingly, our partnership was made in heaven. Of course, New York society didn't know what to think of us. We were young and fabulously rich from mysterious sources out west. Besides, I was clearly not a gentleman. Fortunately, Wild West stories were in vogue then, so they treated me like a cartoon cowboy, which was ironic because I was born 200 miles east of Manhattan. The community was just as puzzled by Amy. My wife was, without a doubt, the most beautiful woman in New York City. Her style reflected her French, Creole, and plantation roots, and her natural sensuality drove men crazy. Women, especially the burly ones, didn't know what to do with her. But Amy was so seductively charming that she became a highly sought-after commodity among the better men. The problem was that we both hated snobs, and it killed any interest in belonging to society. I found parties tedious. Amy was just as annoyed, but life had taught her to mask her feelings, especially contempt. Mostly we just existed for each other, and that was enough for both of us. We had a staff that took care of the mansion, so we spent a lot of time traveling. The railroad system had developed to the point where unimaginable distances were commonplace. In 1860, it took almost 9 months to get from New Orleans to Denver. Now we could get from New York to Denver in a couple of days, comfortably ensconced in our personal railroad car. This convenience allowed us to visit places that were important to us. For example, on our 15th wedding anniversary, I took Amy on a hike to the remote cliff where we first knew each other. Still, it wasn't a great anniversary. For the 20th time, I took Amy with me to New Orleans. She was hesitant at first, given her associations with the place, but I told her she just had to see the rising young musical talent. She thought I was crazy, since she knew I didn't like music, but she agreed because she loved me. A guy was playing a horn and singing something called blues. In those days, it was considered African music, purely debauched, but this guy became famous as a magician using this new art form. He was only 23 years old, but he knew how to mesmerize an audience with his soulful sounds. That's why Amy and I were sitting in a rickety old auditorium in the French Quarter on the sultry night of July 21st, 1881. Up to this point, everything had been very humble. The only special thing was the magic of this guy's music. I could see that Amy was mesmerized by his absolute artistry. I had already bribed the owner. When he finished playing, the young virtuoso came over to us and sat down with us. He was bright and charming, very good-looking, and wearing the latest New Orleans style. He was clearly a ladies' man, and Amy was undoubtedly the most beautiful of the women present, even in her 40s. The man couldn't take his eyes off her. He began flirting outrageously, and of course, my sensual wife happily returned his attention. Money buys power. Accordingly, I managed to summon Alan Pinkerton himself to my little office in Madison Square. I told him that I had a job for his agency, and I was willing to pay an absurd amount of money to get what I needed. Pinkerton was Scottish. He loved money, so he shelled out the unheard of sum of $20,000 up front. It took a year, but finally, his agents came up with a name and a location. Now, it was time. Amy and the young man were sitting in the dim and smoky room, chatting animatedly, when I interrupted them abruptly. I said, "Louis is a very accomplished man, and he has quite a good story to tell." They both looked at me puzzled. Why had I brought it up? I added carelessly, "He taught himself to play the trumpet and came to New Orleans from Natchez in '74. He was only 15. He's probably only 23 now, but he's already a legend in New Orleans." They both looked at me in amazement, except that I looked like I had lost my mind. How did I know all this? I smugly said, "I'll let you two in on a little secret, but you have to promise me that there won't be any unseemly displays." They kept looking at me. Amy was puzzled. Louis was getting angry. He said, "What's this all about, man?" I leaned in conspiratorially and said, "I spent a lot of money to find this out, so please accept what I'm about to tell you as my gift to you both." I paused for effect. Then, with a melodramatic twinkle, I said, "Amy, I want you to meet your son, Louis." For a split second, Amy was speechless. Then she blacked out, turning colder than a mackerel. Louis only looked at me confused. I struggled to handle Amy's dead body as I said, "Give us a second." He nodded, still perplexed. Amy came to her senses almost immediately. I lifted her to her feet and led her outside. She was completely flustered as we stood under the gaslights. I had never seen her like that before. By way of explanation, I said, "The first thing I realized about you is that you are mourning the loss of your child. I love you. That's why I paid Mr. Pinkerton to find him for you." She looked like she was trying to believe me, but it was still so overwhelming. She looked at me triumphantly when I added, "Your boy was released after the war. He grew up under the care of one of the older women in the house. He considers her his mom, and we can leave here right now if you want him to continue to believe that." I sincerely said, "I just wanted you to see what a fine and accomplished young man he has become." I kissed her and gratefully said, "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree," and then added, "So you want to go back there? My wife is a warrior. She doesn't run away from anyone. So, of course she wanted to go back there." Amy's incredible violet eyes blazed as she spoke. "What you've done is the kindest thing imaginable. There was a hole in my heart. Now you've mended it. I will love you forever." Amy's son was still sitting at the table, looking completely dumbfounded. We sat down quietly, and I explained to him the circumstances of his birth without going into too much painful detail. He understood. Every former slave would have understood the story. I said sincerely, "I know you think of Elizabeth's mom as your mother, and she is, but my wife is your biological mother, and she mourns your loss every day of her life." I finished. "I just wanted her to see what a wonderful person you've become and the success you've had." I added kindly, "Now I'm going to leave. I know you two have a lot to talk about." They were both openly crying as I walked out the door. So, I closed Amy's book of regrets, and the years flowed into the next century. A big part of the pleasure of growing old is sharing life's experiences with a special person. And no one was as dear to me as Amy. It's scary when you realize that you have less and less time left. That thought never crossed my mind when I had countless days ahead of me. And yet one of the things about living with the right person is the joy that comes with each day. Like the weather in Louisiana, Amy was a woman of changeable moods. She could be sunny and silly and then deep and sympathetic at the same hour. Whatever was necessary to ensure our happiness together. In that respect, I've never known a woman who could feel the moment so well. I don't know if Amy could sense my moods and adjust to them, or if we were just so alike. But in many ways, we were completely in sync. Of course, we had our differences. Intellectually, Amy was the strongest person I knew. To survive, she had to keep her nature behind adamantine walls. Now she had someone to love, and who loved her in return. She could finally be herself. My wife is of Cajun descent. She has a temper. I've used it, even as we've gotten older. But the ghosts of her past are too deep-seated to be completely exorcised. So there were times when they got the best of her. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she became enraged. And yet we never had one where we didn't know why another person acted or felt a certain way. Yourself? I don't regret anything. When I was pulling oars in a whaleboat, I never imagined I'd be as rich as I am now. I've lived a long life with a wonderful woman, and I've spent almost 70 adventurous years doing whatever I can think of. We built a mansion in Oyster Bay, near Teddy Roosevelt's Sagamore Hill. It was an unassuming place, 30 rooms, a dozen baths, and 80 acres of land. By then, Amy and I were used to the finer things in life. Louis lived with us when he played in New York. He was a charming and intelligent member of our family. Amy adored him. His half-siblings thought he was jazzy, whatever that meant. I knew that was the kind of music he played. But for some reason, I suffered by comparison. I was still a sailor at heart, so I wanted to spend the rest of my time by the sea. I had a 70-foot schooner moored at the foot of the house in Oyster Bay Harbor. Amy and I traveled up and down the East Coast, often making it as far as St. Augustine and even Miami. But I was the captain of that vessel, not a hand on it. But there was still one open account, and I knew I would not die a happy man if that debt was not paid. That's why the second part of the fortune I gave to Pinkerton was for the purpose of tracking down one Esau Briggs. Pinkerton is long dead, but his agency never went away. Eventually they found Briggs in Europe, and that's why he was so hard to find. Perhaps the varmint went abroad because he was afraid of me, but he stayed there because things were much more civilized there. For the last 50 years, Briggs has lived in London on his father's money. So the next day I went to the Cunard office in Manhattan and bought a ticket for 2 for the Mauretania. London in 1911 was a magnificent place. It was the capital of an empire where the sun never set, and the wealth that flooded into the city produced monumental buildings and magnificent mansions. We rented one in Berkeley Square. Neither Briggs nor I were young men, and I never would have had Amy if he hadn't seduced Faith. So maybe it sounds obsessive to chase a grudge for half a century, But it was time to draw a line under that account once and for all. I'd carried the emptiness of Faith's betrayal within me since the day I'd learned of it, and I should have known the reason why. Briggs was the son of the richest man in New Bedford. Now his situation had deteriorated considerably. By the first decade of the 20th century, electric lighting had replaced whale oil lamps, and Mr. Rockefeller's oil had become the most popular lubricant in the industry. Thus, the whaling industry had long since reached its peak. Briggs lived alone. He owned a small house just off Drury Lane, in Dryden Street, on the backside of Covent Garden. The Theatre Royal and the Opera House were close by, and the garden itself was always crowded, so he probably enjoyed the good life. But financially, his affairs were in a constant downward spiral. He took his coffee every morning in a little store on Maiden Lane, not far from the market. I watched him for a few days before I spoke to him. No, I wasn't going to kill him. Too much water had gone over the dam for that. Besides, I'd met and married the woman who was supposed to be by my side. But Faith's shadow still demanded satisfaction. I approached Briggs as he sat at a table near the entrance to the coffee shop. For privacy, he'd pulled it to a corner behind a faux marble column. It was shady and pleasant there. Briggs was reading yesterday's issue of the Daily Mail. I left Amy at our house. It was between me and my past. Amy was well aware of that. She had a few ghosts of her own. Briggs's shoulders slumped as he leaned back in his chair. Life seemed to be weighing on him. I remembered him as small and dapper, a real dandy. The man was obese, but he still wore clothes after the London fashion. It was shabby, as if it had been worn too many times. Perhaps it was his only outfit. I felt like I was back to the way I was when I picked up the paddle. Briggs never bullied me as a kid. That would have been crazy. I was much bigger and tougher than he was, but he always treated me with contemptuous superiority. He looked up, surprised and angry. How dare I intrude on his morning coffee? He saw a large and very rich gentleman, dressed in a tailored brown silk suit from Granville, and a vest, carrying an expensive cane. I was wearing a wide-brimmed fedora to hide my face. Lowering myself into the chair across from him, I said in a friendly tone, "Hello, Esau. Long time no see." My familiarity puzzled him. I obviously knew him, but he had no idea who I was. He said in an irritated voice, "I am drinking my morning coffee, my good man. Why do you bother me?" I took off my hat and leaned forward to look him straight in the eye. I said in a threatening tone, "I wanted to talk to you about Faith Polk. You remember her as Faith Everson." Then I put my hat back on. I wanted to keep my face hidden. Briggs finally recognized me. His first expression was one of horror. It was as if his worst nightmare had popped up on a London street. I said in a friendly manner, "No, I'm not here to finish you off. Perhaps I should have, but I've lived a happy life. I just want to hear the story." Then I threw him a look that gave away my true feelings, and added quietly, "That better be true, or I might change my mind." He muttered, "How can I remember an incident that happened 50 years ago?" I said ominously, "I remember it every day of my life. Now it's time for you to rid me of those memories. What happened between you and Faith?" Old Esau Briggs was beginning to show himself. He couldn't help it. He was too narcissistic. He laughed and said, "It was easy." He paused to savor my distressed look, smirked, and added, "I always wanted to be around Faith, but she never paid attention to anyone but you. I was in Baltimore when I heard about the hurricane, and it got me thinking. I knew you wouldn't be back for a few years, even if your ship wasn't damaged. So I made up a story." He stopped, grinned, and with a wink said, "Your mother didn't believe me. Faith, on the other hand, did. It's like she expected something to happen to you. She told me she always knew she was going to lose you. She felt it every time you drifted away. She said she just loved you too much." It sent me into an agonizing fit of agony. Briggs was now bragging. He said, "Faith went into deep mourning. At first she wouldn't eat and slept all the time. It seemed as if she wanted to die too. I kept coming over and bringing her food and holding her while she cried." He was falling into a frenzy, as if reliving what had happened. "I told her over and over again that she had to let you go. That you were dead." His smug smirk grew more and more nauseating as he added, "She kept asking me if I was sure. I swore on a stack of Bibles that it was true. I was a factor, and we knew these things, Your ship was one of the ones that was lost, and you disappeared. He looked at me cheerfully. One day she was crying, and I was holding her in my arms. She looked up, just for reassurance, I think, and I surprised her with a kiss. She resisted at first, but I knew all her held-back feelings had to go somewhere. Finally, she kissed me back. It was the first time. He stared at me, teasing. She was just as beautiful as I imagined. I knew Faith. She was like that. Briggs laughed and said, I had been enjoying time with her for a couple of months when she announced we were having a baby. She was beyond happy. Can the pain get worse? Briggs finished his coffee and said dismissively, Of course it didn't happen. She was fun to be with for a while, but the high of conquest was gone. I left on the next ship for France. Then he added mockingly, I heard she died giving birth to a baby. He chuckled and said, Well, that's right. Women are just women. I watched Briggs's smug face as he recounted my wife's humiliation. He savored my expression of pain and sadness. It was the last thing he saw. The jury returned. The verdict was in. Sword canes were popular in London before the advent of Bobby Peel's Metropolitan Police. It was the only method of self-defense for a gentleman that did not require openly carrying a blade. Therefore, there were still many good canes available for sale. Mine was a beautiful lacquered specimen, black, with a large, shiny brass handle. Hidden inside, firmly attached to the handle, was an ultra-thin, 2-foot-long, razor-sharp, hardened steel rapier. I pulled it out discreetly, listening to Briggs brag about ruining my wife. It took him a moment to realize what was about to happen. His eyes filled with panic. I hissed with 52 years of hatred, This is for Faith! Then I used my terrible strength to bring the blade out from under the coffee table and be done with it. It was silent and clean. The horror in his gaze vanished almost instantly, replaced by nothingness. With my right hand, I shoved the sword back into the wooden case of the cane. Briggs deserved far worse, but that was all the justice I could do under the circumstances. I prayed that hell existed. Then I made it a point to say a final goodbye to Briggs, just in case anyone was watching. Eventually, people would realize he was without a soul. But by then, I'd be a ghost. The business with my past was done, and the account was finally closed. I had mixed feelings about returning to our home. The debt was cancelled, and I could spend the rest of my days with my perfect friend. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what my life would have been like if Esau Briggs had never been born. Amy waited with the wary look she had honed in her former profession. I said simply, He's done. She asked the practical question, Any witnesses? I shrugged and said, Maybe, but they only saw Briggs talking to a sports guy in a fedora, not a financial tycoon like me. He left us too quickly to make a fuss. She asked, No regrets? I said, Only that I won't live forever, because I have the most wonderful woman in the world to spend my whole life with. I have no qualms about getting rid of this creep. She asked, What's next? I replied, Let's do a grand tour. London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, Rome. I want to stay in Europe until next spring. My sly wife had that familiar look in her eyes. She knew I needed to be reassured. It was early morning, but Amy came over, took my hand, and led me toward our bedroom. She wanted to convey to me the essence of our eternal partnership. Her performance lasted several hours. When we finished our feast, she asked, puzzled, Why are we waiting for spring? I excitedly replied, I've seen many changes at sea, from wooden sailing brigs to steel passenger liners, but I have never seen anything like the ship I booked us on. I continued enthusiastically, This will be her maiden voyage, and she is said to be the fastest and most luxurious liner in the North Atlantic trade. Plus, it features all the new advances in ship design. Why, Titanic is even unsinkable. Epilogue. There was complete pandemonium on the boat deck. They were venting steam from valves high up on the funnels, and the thundering rumble added to the confusion. The time was just over 1 o'clock in the morning, and people were crowding around, mostly just confused, when Second Officer Lightoller started loading the lifeboats. I could see the fear and despair on his face. I thought, This is real. The night was cold and crystal clear. There was a great number of stars in the sky. I had seen many skies during my time at sea, but this diamond-studded velvet canopy was magnificent. I put my arms around Amy and pulled her to me. She was wearing one of her full-length mink coats to protect herself from the cold. I was wearing a heavy tweed all-weather coat and a hat with a flat brim. Amy's maid Ellen was with us, and her friend Betsy, who was Lady Allison's maid. They shared a second-class cabin. We approached lifeboat #8, which was our station. Captain Smith never conducted a formal lifeboat drill. There were too many honorable men aboard to attempt it. But the number of the lifeboat that was assigned to our cabin was written on a small plaque next to the rosewood door of our room. I heard Lightcaller shout, "Women and children only," as he and the crew boarded the people huddled around the boat. We went up with Betsy and Ellen. There were already about 20 women and several crew members in the lifeboat. Lightcaller gallantly assisted Amy as she stepped gracefully over the side. Then Ellen stepped forward. Lightcaller blocked her way. He said, "I'm sorry, miss, but we only have room for one." He turned to me and said politely, "You're next, sir." Ellen's eyes reflected panic. I knew what Lightcaller was talking about. We were obviously first-class passengers, and Ellen was just a maid. I'm not a social warrior, but I couldn't accept the fact that I would keep my ancient skin and this young woman would go down with the ship. So I said, "I will not come aboard while women and children are still on the ship." And I gestured for Ellen to take my place. She looked at me puzzled. I said roughly, "Go to the ship, girl. I'm not going." With those words, Ellen stepped over the side and into the lifeboat. Amy watched the exchange from one of the benches in the lifeboat. Amy stood up as soon as Ellen came aboard. Lightcaller said irritably, "Please be seated, ma'am. We're about to cast off." Amy took off her coat and carefully held it out to Ellen. She said affectionately, "Take it, dear. You'll need it to keep you warm. I don't need it now." Then she gave Lightcaller a menacing look and declared, "I will not part with my husband. As we have lived, so shall we die together." And to my utter amazement, the wife got out of the boat. I said anxiously, "You must get back to the boat, my love. No one can survive in this chilly water." There are moments when Amy's strange violet eyes seem to glow with a deep fire that feeds her soul. She touched my cheek and said affectionately, "Don't argue with me, Jacob. You know you'll never win." Then my wife turned and pushed Betsy, the second maid, into Lightcaller's arms. She said in a voice that tolerated no objection, "This woman will take my place." I looked at Amy with a mixture of surprise and horror. She cast one of her patented, alluring glances at me, took my hand, and said affectionately, "Where you go, I go." With those words, we walked over to a pair of chaise lounges and sat down. We both realized that we were going to die soon. Everyone dies someday anyway, and today was as good a day as any. At least we would leave together. It would be the perfect ending to a lifetime of love. We talked about the early days as the deck continued to tilt. Finally, I took both of her hands in mine and said fervently, "Forever!" She gave me a loving smile and simply replied, "Yes." Her violet eyes engulfed me as the dive began. And so, our story draws to a close. A tale of love, loss, and redemption, woven through the tapestry of American history. From the untamed wilderness to the glittering metropolis, our protagonists have faced challenges that would have broken lesser souls. We've witnessed the power of human connection, the resilience of the spirit, and the enduring nature of love. As we bid farewell to these unforgettable characters, we're left with a sense of profound satisfaction and a touch of melancholy. This epic journey has been a privilege to share with you. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary adventure. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more captivating stories. And if you crave even deeper dives into this world, check out the full story on our Patreon page. Until next time, keep exploring, keep dreaming, and remember, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the echoes of those tales can last a lifetime.